When I was in high school, I had a teacher who was kind of a difficult teacher. He was my English teacher, and oh yeah, I'm getting it. No, I'm good. Anyways, he was a difficult person. And in class, in English class in high school, you read books, whatever, and we would take turns reading the books out loud, reading the different sections out loud. And some of those books had swear words. And when I was in high school, I was especially uncomfortable with using swear words. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm an adult now, and sometimes I do use those words, but I didn't when I was in high school. And so when it would come to be my turn, I would get to those words, and I would use a less offensive word. And for some reason, my English teacher had a problem with that. He didn't like it. I'm not really sure why. Maybe he thought that it ruined the integrity of the book. But he said to me in front of the entire class, "Why? Well, you're not going to say those words? What's up with that?" And I was like, "No, I don't want to say those words. I'm not comfortable with that." And, I find that this happens a lot in our lives, right? Where somebody tries to convince us to do something that we're not comfortable with. There's all kinds of things that I'm not comfortable with that people have tried to convince me to do. Like, I don't want to go in a haunted house. Just letting y'all know now, I don't want to go in a haunted house. I don't want to go somewhere where somebody's going to jump out and scare me. At least when I'm watching a scary movie, I can cover my eyes. And I watch through my fingers, That just feels safer to me. I also don't like going water tubing. I don't know why. I've never done it. I don't want to. Don't ask me. It makes me really uncomfortable. My dad was really afraid of heights. He's not around anymore, so I'm allowed to tell. He did not like heights. If we were in a building way up high and there was like a window, and we would be like, "Wow, Dad, look at how beautiful the view is," he would say, "Nope, I'm good over here. I'm not going to look." So I think that happens to all of us, right? Where somebody tries to convince us to do something that we're not comfortable with. Maybe people try to convince you to ride a roller coaster or eat something that you don't like. Maybe somebody tries to convince you to sing karaoke in front of a bunch of strangers or go hiking. And the people who do this, they say like, "What's the big deal? It's not going to kill you." Well, I'm not comfortable with it. I don't want to do it. I asked my Facebook friends, what is something that people have tried to convince you to do that you weren't comfortable with? And I thought that some of their responses were pretty funny. They said talking on the phone, talking about personal finances, small talk, just in general, small talk, interacting with people. I thought that was pretty funny. I had one person said growing up. They didn't like that people wanted them to grow up. And I can relate to a lot of those. I bet you can too. So at Sycamore Creek, we take time throughout the message to chat with the people who are nearer to us. And I want to encourage you to talk about this with somebody next to you. But I also want to let you know, if you're not comfortable with the question that's posed ever at Sycamore Creek, you don't have to talk about that question. I'm not going to force you like I just was talking about. You can talk about something else. But the question that I would love if you were comfortable with, you could talk to somebody about, when was a time someone tried to convince you to do something that you just weren't comfortable with? So my name is Gretchen Williams, as Mikkel told you earlier, and I'm a member here at Sycamore Creek. I most often attend the South Lansing campus, and I'm a member of the teaching team, which I really love being a part of. And I am so excited that we are here at Regal Cinema for the whole month of July. It's so exciting. Oh yeah, you can cheer, that's good, yes. This is honestly, live on location is my favorite thing that we do as a church. So we're starting this series today called Epic Tales. And we borrowed this series from Church of the Resurrection, in Kansas City. And so we're going to talk about those big Old Testament stories that we learned as children. The stories that you read in your children's Bibles? All of those Bibles had like beautiful illustrations, and they were worded in ways that kids could understand. Or maybe you learned it in Sunday school growing up in church, and your Sunday school teacher taught you some little songs to help you remember the stories. Hope is saying no, because we do things a little differently at Sycamore Creek. Or maybe if you're as lucky as I was to grow up in the 90s, you learned them from some very silly vegetables. Yes, I think you all know what I'm talking about. But as adults, we don't really color in the lines of these stories so much. We don't learn and grow from them. And so that's what we're going to do in this series. We're going to look at these stories we've learned as kids and kind of dive deeply into them. So I asked a few of the kids in our church if they would be willing to tell what they know about the story of Daniel and the lion's den, and here's what they said.
There was a guy named Daniel that was in the lion's den.
Right, hold up. There's more to that story.
Darius was the new king of Babylon, and Daniel was chief helper, and the other helpers did not like Daniel.
The king told everyone that they couldn't pray to God. They could only pray to the king. And so Daniel was a very faithful man, and he decided to pray anyway.
Because of this, he was thrown into a den full of lions, but God protected him, and he wasn't harmed.
Then God sent an angel to protect him from the lions.
And in the morning, when the king opened the den, expecting to find Daniel dead, he was alive, sleeping peacefully with the lions.
This story teaches us to have faith and to do what's right, even when it's difficult.
I think Eric covered it for me, yeah? Okay, I'm out. Just kidding. I did prepare a message for you today. But that was so great, wasn't it? Our kids did a really good job. Let's give them a hand. Hi, CJ. That's my kid right there waving. He really wants to be on the screen. Anyways, okay, so when we're talking about Daniel and the lion's den, it's good and helpful for us to understand the book of Daniel. And this book was written to a group of exiled Israelites who were in distress. They were living under a terrorizing reign of foreign kings and kingdoms. They were struggling with foreign languages, foreign customs, foreign methods and routines in an unfamiliar land, and they were walking in a time of darkness. There are 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and it seems to be split into two distinct sections. Chapters 1 through 6 read kind of like storybook tales. These are stories that took place in the courts, and because Daniel helped in the king's court. So you might have told these stories like around the kitchen table or around a campfire, maybe like a bedtime story. The second half of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, reads like a cryptic science fiction novel. It's these dreams and visions that Daniel had of an apocalyptic future. They were strange and mystical, that even Daniel struggled to understand these dreams or what they meant. But it seems clear that the dreams were about the end times. And we see in these dreams, as they're being explained to Daniel, that in the end times we will see a new reign where God would rule in all his glory. And this book is it's a picture of hope for these people in exile. It's a picture of a future where God would be the one true God ruling over all. Daniel, in the book, doesn't really pay attention to historical timelines, not really going for historical accuracy, at least as we understand it. But it's an uplifting story. It's hope-filled. And Daniel is a prominent figure of our faith. I believe through his story that we can learn how to walk through times of distress and dark times that we go through. And I want to talk about 3 things that Daniel teaches us, 3 ways to walk courageously through dark times. So in the beginning of the story, as I said, the Israelites were exiled in Babylon. And the king at the time was King Nebuchadnezzar. I love saying his name. I think it's really cool. King Nebuchadnezzar. He asked his chief of staff to bring some young men who were the exiled people, like the Judah's family of royalty or nobilities. Bring some of those men to him. Only strong, healthy, and good-looking men. Some who were highly intelligent, they had good judgment, and some who were suited to working in the palace, to serving in the royal palace. They were to be trained in the Babylonian ways, the literature and the language of Babylon. And the 4 men that are named in the book of Daniel are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And these men were given new names in Babylon. Daniel was Belteshazzar, Hananiah was Shadrach, Mishael was Meshach, and Azariah was Abednego. Some of those names might sound familiar to you. The king assigned these men portions of food and wine from his own table. And honestly, they were going to be trained for 3 years, and they were asked ultimately to give up everything that they knew, everything that made them who they were, everything that reminded them of where they came from, and what made them Jewish, really. They were even given new names. And when they were assigned these portions of food and wine, Daniel said, no, enough is enough. He wanted to be allowed to keep kosher. Now, we don't really know why that was so important to Daniel, but what I think is that perhaps that was a way for him to hold on to his Jewish heritage, a way for them to remember who they were deep inside. And so he asked the chief of staff if he could be allowed to keep kosher, him and his friends. And the chief of staff said, no, surely King Nebuchadnezzar would have me beheaded if I did that. You know, I read up on the significance of this food and wine, these like portions, because I was really curious about this. And it said that the food on the king's table would likely be what remained of the food that was offered to the Babylonian gods. So if they were to eat this food and wine, it would almost be as if it was thanks to these Babylonian gods that they continued to grow strong and healthy. But Daniel asked that they not be allowed, or that they be not expected to defile their bodies. So after the chief of staff said no, he went to the attendant of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that conversation went something like this. He said, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. So what do you think happened? Well, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and more nourished than the other men who were going through this training. So they did eventually be allowed to continue to keep kosher and eat in this way. And so in this way, it was thanks to the God of Daniel and his friends that they grew strong and healthy. And it allowed them to remember who they were and who they belonged to. I mentioned earlier that Daniel, the book of Daniel, was written to a group of exiled Israelites. And they were going through this hard time of darkness. And I think for all of us, when we go through a time of darkness, sometimes we lose sight of who we are. We begin to think that we don't hold much value or worth. I know for me, sometimes I think, I'm never going to get out of this time of darkness. I'm not strong enough or capable enough to handle it and to make it through to better and brighter times. In times of darkness, we must not lose sight of who we are. We belong to God, and that to God, we are worth more than we could even imagine. And so that's the first thing that I think Daniel teaches us, is that when we're walking in darkness, we shouldn't lose sight of who we are, no matter the cost. The next part of the story is about Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. After the king's training was over, King Nebuchadnezzar was very impressed with Daniel and his friends. So they entered the royal service. King Nebuchadnezzar noticed that these four men were 10 times better in all ways than the other men that were in the same position, their colleagues, so to speak. And so that made their colleagues kind of jealous, and they wanted to find a way to bring them down. In the meantime, King Nebuchadnezzar decided to erect a statue it's like a golden statue that was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. This thing was enormous. So for reference, I'm exactly 5 feet tall, so there's little me on the screen. This statue was like 18 of me stacked up on each other. That's really big, right? So the scripture doesn't really indicate what this statue was of, although a lot of people believe that the statue was of Nebuchadnezzar himself. But it was decreed that whenever the people heard this music playing, that they would bow down and worship Nebuchadnezzar, bow down to this statue. And if they failed to do so, they would be thrown into a fiery furnace and ultimately sentenced to death. I bet you can imagine where this is going. One day, the music played, and everybody bowed down. Everybody except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't really know where Daniel was at this time, because this is just about these three men. And they were caught by their colleagues and the king's other advisors. And so those men brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the king and told them what happened. And King Nebuchadnezzar was furious. So he had them bound together and thrown into the fiery furnace. And not only that, he had them heat the furnace 7 times hotter than it ever was. But then the king looked in and he saw something strange. He said, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" And of course his advisors and the soldiers, the people around him said, "Yeah, we had 3 men, we threw them into the furnace." And the king says, "But I see 4 men in the furnace. They're not burning up, and one of them looks like a god." What? That's crazy, right? So the king called for them to come out. Not only were they not burned alive, but there appeared to be another man with them. So when they called the 3 men out, they gathered around and everybody was looking at them. Not a single part of their body was singed, not even their clothes. It's a miracle. The king Nebuchadnezzar said this. He said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Oh, I love that. There's no other God who could rescue like this. Now, maybe King Nebuchadnezzar took it a little too far. Well, won't talk about that. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not only were they walking in a time of exile, this dark time, but they were being forced to abandon who they were, and then they faced certain death to remain faithful to God. In times of despair and darkness, we must stand up, and when we do, God will be standing with us, and God will never leave us. That is so exciting to me. This story gets me really excited, guys. So let's stand up, and God will stand with us. If we stand for what we believe in, we can be sure that God will be right there by our side. It reminds me of a scripture I read in Isaiah. "Do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. And when you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you." I can imagine that not many of us, maybe none of us, have ever faced the possibility of death to stand up for our faith. But let's talk about this question. When was a time that you faced scrutiny, oppression, or other hardships for standing up for your faith? So the next part of the story, this is like the highlight. This is the one that we highlighted at the beginning. After King Nebuchadnezzar's rule, Daniel worked under King Darius. And Daniel rose up in the ranks of the king's court until he was to be placed over the entire empire. He was doing a real good job, and King Darius really liked him. And his colleagues were, I think, understandably jealous. I would be jealous if somebody in the same position as me was doing way better than me, right? So his colleagues wanted to find a way to catch him doing something wrong, but they couldn't. The scripture says that Daniel was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. He was a man of integrity. They realized they could only accuse Daniel of a misstep if they tripped him up based on his faith. So they went to the king. They had an idea. They conspired together and went to the king and said, "You should make a decree or a law that says that for 30 days, everyone in this empire would only pray to you and no other god or other person. And if they do, they would be thrown into the lion's den." Well, the king was convinced, I think probably a little too easily. The king was convinced and signed this decree into law. But Daniel had no fear. He did not change anything about himself. He went to his upstairs room with the windows wide open to Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day, just like he always had. Even though he knew that continuing to pray could result in his death, he didn't back down. He prayed the same way, even in the face of death. Daniel chapter 6 says, "The officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied. That decision stands. It's an official law of the Medes and Persians and cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, this man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. It's kind of like when kids tattle, right? This guy is doing the wrong thing. He's praying to his God. So King Darius loved Daniel. They were friends. And so he was terribly troubled by this. And so he spent that whole day and into the night trying to figure out a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. But he couldn't. He couldn't figure out a way. He cared about Daniel, and he didn't want him to die. But he also knew that if he were to change the law to allow Daniel not to be harmed, that this could really reflect badly on him. He would be prone to lose his power. His followers, his supporters, might even oust him right out of his position. So he made a terrible decision to uphold the decree that he had signed and to have Daniel thrown into the lion's den, making Daniel ultimately pay the price for his poor judgment in making this law in the first place. Daniel shows us that when we are walking through times of darkness, we should continue to pray. But honestly, there's only one logical conclusion to Daniel being thrown in the lion's den, right? He would be killed. The lions would tear him apart. But the next day, King Darius went to the mouth of the lion's den and said, Daniel, are you still alive? Did your God rescue you from the lions? Daniel told the king that God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions so that they would not hurt him because he was found innocent in the eyes of God. Yay! Come on, guys, give it up. That's pretty miraculous if you ask me. Daniel's miraculous survival shows us that no power can overpower God. And the king was overjoyed because Daniel was his friend. He had them bring Daniel out, and there wasn't a single scratch on him. Wow, that's amazing. Daniel shows us that if we remain faithful to God and continue to pray, even in the face of dark times, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Daniel and King Darius both could see the power of God with Daniel. And even King Darius could see that there was no earthly power that could overpower the one true God. Have you ever thought about, what if you were in King Darius's shoes? What if you had to decide between being powerful and well-liked or something that you believe strongly in, like Darius believed in Daniel? Have you ever wondered what you would do in that situation? I want to show you a clip from Scott Crostek, who shared a message about Daniel at the Church of the Resurrection. And he asks some really tough questions, and I think they will really challenge us in what we take away from the story of Daniel.
I was reading a commentary about this, and it shared that we should never believe people who say that our human decisions can't be changed. If we are hurting people, if the laws we have made are causing harm to innocent people, we should change them. Unjust or wrong human law and human praxis can always be changed, even though it may seem more dangerous to admit that than to risk the consequences of refusing change. Darius wasn't willing to risk his power. Instead, he maintained the status quo because of his rigidity, his unwillingness to change his mind, to change his opinion, to give in to pride, to be humble. And the byproduct was that Daniel was going to have to spend a night in the den of lions. I want to ask you just for a second, what positions, worldviews, stands, what decisions have you made? What laws have you voted for or not supported? What are you doing that is causing or has caused harm? Where are you stuck? And why are you unwilling to change? This is part of what we learn from Daniel. King Darius was unwilling to change. He was unwilling to be humble. He was unwilling to give up what he had in order to save an innocent person's life.
Those are some tough questions. So tough, if I'm honest, I was a little nervous to pose them myself, which is why I let Scott do it for me. But I just want to remind you of what Scott said. He said, what positions, worldviews, or stands, what decisions have you made? What laws have you voted for or not supported? What are you doing that is causing or has caused harm? Where are you stuck, and why are you unwilling to change? I hope you'll take some time this week to think about these questions, pray on them, and ask God to show you where you might struggle with these things. I want to bring one last thing to your attention, and that is there are parallels between Daniel's story and Jesus. Daniel's story really is a precursor to what Jesus went through in his life and ministry before he died. Both Daniel and Jesus had consistent patterns of prayer. They were both victims of political conspiracy. They were both betrayed by those close to them. They both remained faithful in the end. They both suffered the consequences of religious competition and a struggle for political power that would result in certain death. And they were each a singular, outmanned Jew. The difference between these two men, Daniel never endured death because he wasn't the Christ. The Christ wasn't yet to come. Daniel's similarities to Christ, though, points us to him. God's Son came and he endured death in the face of religious persecution. And he returned again from the dead to declare God's power, to usher in a new kingdom where God would be glorified because there is no earthly power that can overpower God. The coming of God's kingdom is a reason for rejoicing. There is no more mourning and no more weeping. And God's kingdom will never end. And in this kingdom, there is redemption, even for King Darius. After seeing that Daniel was unharmed, King Darius had an interesting response. He said that to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world, peace and prosperity to you, I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never end, or his kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. God honored Daniel and his friends for keeping kosher, for remembering who they were. God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace because they stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar and remained faithful. God protected Daniel from the lions because Daniel never stopped praying. It is said that Gandhi believed that Daniel was a hero who willingly chose to suffer over compromising his deeply held moral conscience. Daniel was the greatest passive resistor that ever lived. And this is much more than just going against something that makes us uncomfortable, like I talked about earlier, right? This is standing up against something that you truly believe in and saying, no, I will not do that thing. I hope that Daniel's story shows you that God will always be with you no matter what darkness you're walking through. There's always hope because God is always with us. God's love remains steadfast, and God is faithful, always. So I want to address the elephant in the room. I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it's not. You may be thinking that I'm full of crap because you were in the fire and you prayed for God to rescue you. You stood up for your faith. And you remembered who you were, who you belonged to, but God did not pull you out of the fire. If I'm being totally honest, I've thought the very same thing. I have a friend who was in a similar fire that I was in their life. We were both struggling and in pain, and we both prayed for God to pull us out of this fire. And for my friend, God did pull them out of the fire. But for me, he did not. And I don't know why that is. I think this is a question that all Christ followers have been asking since the beginning of time. If God can rescue us, why does he rescue some people from their struggles and their pain and not others? The truth is, I just don't know. I don't think any of us will know while we are on this earth. And it's okay to be angry. It's okay to cry out to God and ask why. Why am I not being saved from this fire that I'm in? I think God can take it. God knows our pain, our hearts, our hurts, and every fire we've ever experienced. But this is where Jesus comes in. There's a chance that on this earth, while we live in this life, the fires, the struggles, the pain that we experience will never end. Bad things happen. It's just a reality. But Jesus conquered death. We know that because of this, God holds the true victory. And in this mysterious, mystical future that Daniel dreamed about, we also experience the victory. Adam Hamilton, who is the lead pastor of the Church of the Resurrection, he's quoted as saying, "The worst is not the last." Because God had the last word when Jesus rose from the grave. And so, Daniel teaches us that we are called to remember who we are, that we're good and that we're worthy in God's eyes, no matter how dark things get. When we have the courage to stand up for our faith, God will be right by our side, always, always with us, even when we feel like the fire will never end. And God longs for us to pray. Daniel models for us the power of prayer in all circumstances, even when the law of the land doesn't allow it. And when we do these things, we can do them with the confidence that no power can overpower God. Amen.